Welcome to Bass Conversations podcast, episode number 3, with Stephen Mooney from Constructing Walking Jazz Basslines. In this episode, I'm just going to be following on from episode 2 when we were talking about construction of basslines using the blues as a vehicle for developing lines. This time around, I'll be giving some examples using the blues in B flat, and again, I recommend writing lines. So what I'll be doing is I'll be giving some examples linked to this podcast with the blues progression written out in B flat. I'll give some examples of some bass lines, and then for those of you that are serious about building a walking bassline vocabulary, what I would suggest is to try writing your own lines using some of the vehicles and the devices that I talk about in the podcast. So one of the things that I do when I'm first starting out with developing a line on the blues or on a standard is quite often I'll set up a 2-feel on the first chorus, and to develop that line, most often what I'll use is root fifth and triads, which is something that I talked about in the previous podcast. So for the first chorus, I would play like a pretty basic 2-feel, and then what I would do in the second chorus is, depending on the melody, I would then use some rhythmic embellishment of the 2-feel. And as I get around to the turnaround, approaching the turnaround to come into the top of the tune, I would then start to set up what I'm going to be playing in the next chorus. Now, if I'm going to be playing a walking bass 4 to the bar type feel, then in the last few bars of the form, what I'm going to be doing is hinting that I'm going into 4. If it's a ballad or something like that, then potentially the tune could stay in 2 for the entire time. So then you would hint that you're going to be staying with the 2 feel. So it's very important to be clear about where you're going, and to give the other members of the band an idea of what you might be thinking about. The other thing that you need to be aware of is you need to be flexible, because you may be thinking that you're going to be staying in 2, but the saxophone player has another idea. So if you hear that the saxophone player is going into a straight ahead time feel, like a 4-feel or a double time feel, then you have to be prepared to go with that. So you need to be flexible. One way to be flexible is to have a lot of options available to you, and that is where experience comes into play. And again, I talk about writing lines and making lists, and I'll mention things like that quite often. The way to get experience and to have a large amount of devices to use is to be able to practice specific ideas in your practice time by making a list and thinking about what devices are you going to use when you're developing lines. Because just because Ron Carter uses a certain set of devices, it doesn't mean that you're going to have to use those same devices as well. One of the things that I talked about previously was having your own identity as a musician and as a bassist, and that is largely based around the choices that you make, and the choices that you make are largely based around the type of devices that you have in your skill set. So that's very important. It's as you are developing as a musician, develop your skill set and develop what you have available to you. One of the challenges of creating lines is to have variation in the line and still outline the chord changes. So for a beginning player, that can be a challenge, and even for players of more experience, especially if you're playing with a good saxophone player or trumpet player or piano player that likes to really stretch out on the solos. Easily a tune can develop into a 10 or 15 minute blowing session. So how are you going to develop lines that are outlining the changes and varying the information that you're providing? So one thing that I think about when I'm walking lines behind a solo player is in the beginning of the tune, you really want to outline the chord changes. So for the first few choruses, I would really be thinking about staying pretty inside, playing the root note on the downbeat, and just be very clear about what it is I'm saying, what harmonic choices I'm making. Then, as the tune starts to develop, there's no set rule that says that you have to play the root note on the downbeat of the chord change every time. We have options there. I mean, if we're developing lines using the triad, then we have the choice of using the root note, the third, the fifth, or the octave. So making a small change to what is your leading note on the chord change is going to have quite a strong impact on the sound of the lines. And what that does is it gives some inspiration to the soloist to maybe think in a different direction than what they may have thought previously. So you want to be in a situation where you can either inspire the soloist by making choices, or the other thing that you have to consider is you have to be listening to what they are saying as well, because it's a conversation between the whole band. It's not just a group of people playing individually and oblivious to one another. So if you hear somebody playing a specific choice, you have to be flexible and you have to be able to go with that. Now, just building on from using the triad, the next step would be to use the seventh chords, and what we do then is really we're just adding one note to the triad. So you'd be using the seventh on a dominant seventh, that would be a flattened seventh, and on a minor seven that would also be a flattened seventh, and obviously on a major seventh that would be the major seventh or a semitone away from the root note. So once we add in the seventh, it gives us a lot more variation on the line. So that's one thing that I would be thinking about is now that you have developed lines using the triad, the next step is to be able to walk lines just using the seventh chord. We're not going to be thinking about using any chromatics or anything like that, and just write some lines out and develop some lines using the seventh chord. And I will be giving some examples of how to go about things like that. They'll be linked to the podcast. When we're practicing things like this in our practice room, and we're developing our technique to be able to take onto the bandstand, what I think it is very important is to be able to just isolate ideas and practice a certain idea. Now, so far we've talked about using intervals like the root and the fifth, and then the triad, and now I've just introduced a new idea of using the seventh chord. So what I would do if I'm practicing is I would isolate those ideas and I would set up a play along I would write out some lines, and what I would do is I would write out maybe a half a dozen choruses of each idea, and then practice those ideas individually and just be very clear on what it is that you're saying. Now, the reason that I would do something like that is I want to be sure that I know that I can pull out any of those devices on the fly at any given time. It can be very important, especially if things start to get a little bit unstable or uncertain in where people are in the form. It's very important to be able to go back to a very functional and foundational type of bass line that says this is where we are in the harmony. And as a bass player, that is something that you are required to do, and that is what's going to get you hired again and again. So now that you have those devices together and you've been able to play them individually, then it's time to start to mix them up. So now what I would do is I would write out some lines using those three devices, using the root, the fifth, the octave, the triad, and the seventh chord. And having those three devices is now going to give you a lot of options for building a simple line. Now, I say a simple line, but to do anything well and to do anything with integrity, it's far from simple. It may sound simple to somebody that is, not familiar with the amount of work that it takes, but being able to play strong lines with good time and with a good tone takes a lot of work, as most of you will know. So, although something may sound simple, it doesn't mean it's easy. What it means is that the person that is making that line sound so good and so simple has invested a lot of their time and energy into getting to that level. And that's not easy. Another thing I'd like to talk about today is practicing rudiments and making an exercise your own, making it so that it fits into the style of music that you're playing at the moment or something that you're working towards. Perhaps you have a certain gig coming up. You can use some exercises that you are practicing already to suit that gig that's coming up. So even an exercise like playing scales or playing arpeggios, there's a lot of variation in there, and you can design or put your own slant onto any of those exercises by thinking about what you have coming up. So a simple exercise like playing scales or playing diatonic sevenths, when we play an exercise like that, more often than not, it's played in eighth notes or straight quarter notes. But any of these exercises you can put into a particular rhythm. You can, for example, put a funk groove on there, or turn these exercises into a 16th note groove, or even turn them into a walking bass feel. And something that I used to practice quite a lot was walking lines through the inversions of the diatonic sevenths, and that's something that I'll go into in a later podcast, because that is pretty involved. It's it takes a lot to get down, but I'll just briefly talk about that and the effect that it had on my playing. First of all, it's a good ear training exercise to hear the chords played in various inversions, and it's also very good for finger dexterity for the left and the right hand, because it's a challenge to play those exercises across the strings, or it's even more challenging to play the exercise down on 2 strings, but it sets up a lot of challenges or problems that need to be worked out between the fingerings of the left hand and the right hand. And working on something like that is one of the things that I like to do, because, as I've mentioned before, I like to work on exercises that are addressing more than one issue at one time. And that is a way to make progress faster. So working on an exercise like that, it is definitely a stretch to play walking lines on inversions of the diatonic sevenths. So if anybody's listening and they would like to contact me and get some more information on that, you can go ahead and shoot me an email through my website. But in the future, I'll be going into that in more depth in one of the upcoming podcasts. As we are developing as a musician, one of the things that is vitally important is to listen to the masters from whatever style of music you're listening to. In previous podcasts, I've talked a lot about walking bass line and jazz bass players. People like Wilbur Ware, Paul Chambers, Jimmy Garrison, Ray Brown, Ron Carter. If you're playing jazz, these are people that you definitely want to be checking out. If you're more into Motown, then somebody that you want to be checking out is Jamie Jameson or Donald Duck Dunn. And if you're a fusion player, then you definitely want to be checking out somebody like Jaco Pastorius. Get inspiration from the masters. Listen to what they did, try to transcribe their lines, figure out what they were doing harmonically and rhythmically, and then use that information to build your vocabulary and to build your identity. And during the week, I was listening to a Duke Ellington track, Jack the Bear, with Jimmy Blanton on bass. And Jimmy is one of the masters of the walking bass, and it's interesting to hear Jimmy Blanton's solo on that tune. It really is a bass feature, and for those of you that are not aware of that track, I would definitely check that out, Jack the Bear. I transcribed the tune a couple of years ago, and recently I listened to the tune again, and I listened to the outro of Jimmy Blanton's solo, and I'm thinking to myself, wow, that really sounds like Wilbur Ware. And this is where developing your sound from a master is tied in, because Wilbur obviously listened to Jimmy Blanton a lot, and he took that vocabulary and he built it and he stripped it down. He looked at what was going on and he developed that into his sound. So when you listen to Wilbur Ware, you can hear immediately that it's Wilbur Ware, but if you listen closely and you have listened to a wide variety of music and you go back and you listen to what's happened in history before these players, that's when you start to realize that's what these people have done. They've checked somebody out that they like the style of their lines or the style of their solos. They've transcribed it and they've developed it, and they've developed it into their own personality. And that is something that if you listen to the track Jack the Bear, And then you listen to Wilbur's playing on the Sonny Rollins album Live at the Village Vanguard, the trio recording of Sonny, Elvin, and Wilbur. If you listen to a track like Softly as in the Morning Sunrise, I think it is, you will hear that is where Wilbur got that style from. He lifted it directly from Jimmy Blanton. He's paying his respects to Jimmy Blanton with his own style of playing. And that's what a big part of jazz is. It's finding something or somebody that you identify with, developing what you hear from their style, and building on it. So in one respect, you are paying respect to somebody that you have admired their playing or their vocabulary, and you are saying, well, this is where I got that from, but this is my take on it. This is how I'm going to say, because this is me and this is not Jimmy Blanton or Wilbur Ware or whoever. Another person that I would definitely check out, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard of this bass player, but he is still around, and you definitely got to check him out. And the person that I'm talking about is Nat Reeves. And if you listen to Nat Reeves, what you'll hear Oscar Pettiford. Nat is one of the greatest bass players around today, and he has played with players such as Jackie McLean, Pharoah Sanders, Kenny Garrett. It's no surprise that he's played with those musicians, because he has put in the work. He's done a lot of work. He plays great. He's got a good sound. He plays good time. But not only that, you can hear the tradition in when he plays. And there's some great examples of his playing on YouTube where you can see him playing with Jackie McLean or Pharoah Sanders. It's well worth checking out Nat Reeves. For those of you that are able to see live music, if he comes to a city near you, I would highly suggest going to see him play live. It's one thing to watch somebody on YouTube, but it's another thing to experience them in a live setting. You go to a club, you see the musicians. Not only do you see and hear the music, but you feel it. Music, especially the bass, if you're in a good club with good acoustics, you're going to feel the bass. And once you get that feeling, that's what you're going to be going for. Jazz bucket list. Just continuing on from the last podcast, I'm going to be suggesting another couple of albums to check out when you have time. And one of them I mentioned previously in this podcast, and that record is Live at the Vanguard. It's a Sonny Rollins album, trio recording with Sonny Rollins on tenor, Elvin Jones on drums, and Wilbur Ware on bass. And this is a great record. Sonny is playing some of his originals, and he plays a mixture of standard tunes as well. And anybody that's serious about transcribing bass players, this is a record that you should definitely check out. I mean, I transcribed this whole record. Wilbur's playing, not Sonny's solos. That's something that I need to check out in the future, but transcribing this record had a very big impact on my development as a bass player. Yeah, so I would highly recommend checking that out. Sonny Rollins, live at the Vanguard. Another album that I've been listening to a lot lately is a Dexter Gordon album, and that is called Biting the Apple. This is a great record. It's Dexter in the 70s, and he has Sam Jones on bass, fantastic bass player, Al Foster on drums, Barry Harris on piano, and no doubt Dexter Gordon on tenor. So this is a great album to check out. They do a great take of Blue Bossa on this record, and Blue Bossa is one of those tunes where you hear a lot of beginning players start up playing that tune, but Dexter and the guys on this recording, they take that tune to another level. It's very well worth checking out. Dexter's sound, he's just got that classic sound that Dexter is known for, and his ability to be able to pull melodies and quote melodies on improvisations of tunes is, he's a master of that. So I would highly recommend checking out Biting the Apple, Dexter Gordon. Another record that I would like to recommend is the Vanguard recordings of John Coltrane. That's a box set, and you hear various lineups of the group. There's a classic recording of a trio of John Coltrane on tenor, Jimmy Garrison on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums playing Chasing the Train, and it goes for about 17 minutes, I believe, and that is some of the finest trio playing that you are likely to hear. So that's what I will be suggesting this week. Again, if there's anybody listening to the podcast that has any questions, feel free to send me an email through my website, constructingwalkingjazzbasslines.com. Thank you for the people that reached out to me last time. It's nice to hear that people are getting something out of the podcast, and it's just great to be able to share information with people that are trying to do the same thing that I was trying to do and that I am still trying to do. So it's great to be able to help people and to get feedback. If there's anybody out there that's interested in studying with me, again, you can take lessons with me online from anywhere in the world by just sending me an email, and we'll take it from there. Okay, thank you very much. I'll speak to you next time. Thanks.